Okay, we are in the last section of this book with a few chapters remaining. I hope to wrap this up soon. Part 4 here is called Taking Action, Adaptation, Mitigation and Governance. The first chapter under this section is called International Perspective on Climate Change Adaptation by Christy Eby, who has done lots of work on health, climate and adaptation issues. I will start with this figure which we have already looked at, the summary of impacts of climate change on all continents and the oceans, divided into physical systems, biological systems, human and managed systems, and there are regional scale impacts. These include glaciers, snow, ice and or permafrost, rivers, lakes, floods and drought, coastal erosion and sea level effects under physical systems. Biological systems, of course, include terrestrial ecosystems, marine ecosystems and wildfires. Human and managed systems include food production, livelihoods, health and or economics. The confidence limits are shown. All peer-reviewed literature is combined to look at confidence levels of very low, low, medium, high and very high. And again, the main point to note is that all continents and all oceans, including the polar Antarctic region and Arctic region, are seeing evidence of human impacts, climate change, anthropogenic climate change impacts on all the systems, essentially physical, biological and human and managed systems. So mitigation and adaptation is basically about either reducing our impact on these systems or adapting to changes that are already manifest, like the extreme events that we are, especially in July of this year 2021 as I'm recording this, there's heat waves, massive heat waves that killed lots of marine animals and killed humans over northwest US and Canada. Floods in Germany that killed over 100 people. Floods in India that have killed I think more than 100 people. And there are droughts still going on in western US and so on and so forth. So such extremes are tracked constantly by a group across the globe, summarized by NOAA. Here are the selected significant climate anomalies and events for June 2021. June 2021 average global surface temperature was the 5th highest for June since global records began in 1880. Arctic sea ice extent, US impacts, East North Pacific Basin, Hurricane Enrique, South American impacts in terms of heat waves, and so here are southern regions had near average temperatures, whereas the northern South America had warmer than average temperatures. Europe is struggling, as we saw. Asia, June 2021 temperature departure tied with 2010 as the second highest June on record. Africa had its warmest June on record. 4 named storms through June, tying with 2012, 2016 and 2020 for the most number of named storms so far in this season. New Zealand even saw warmest June since national records began in 1909. 9 named storms across the globe in terms of cyclones in June, which is one storm shy of tying the record of most storms in the month set in 1997 and again in 2018. So obviously here we are focused on health, so these all have to be translated to impacts on health, which we have done. But you can see that when we talk about climate change mitigation and adaptation, health mitigation, health adaptation has to be part of the system policy designs, implementations and so on. So again, looking at framework for adaptation, research over the past 30 years on the impacts of climate change has led to a more nuanced framework of how climate change could affect human and natural systems. The magnitude and extent of possible risks of climate change depend on the interaction of changes in temperature, precipitation, and other weather variables, and in sea level rise and ocean acidification. Human and natural systems exposed to these changes, including people and their livelihoods, infrastructure, economic, social, and cultural assets, environmental services, and resources. Vulnerability of these systems, where vulnerability is defined as the propensity or predisposition to be affected. Okay, so this is a broader way to look at it. We cannot really always separate adaptation and mitigation, even though by now you probably got the idea that mitigation is the concept of reducing our impact and taking actions like energy efficiency, renewable energy, combined heat and power, sustainable transportation, methane capture and use, industrial process improvements, and carbon sinks. Whereas adaptation is to deal with things that are already changing, and like doing afforestation, open space preservation, land use changes and relocation, managed retreat as it's often called as well, infrastructure protection and building design, flood mitigation, emergency responses, business continuity plans, and community engagement. There are some that straddle both adaptation and mitigation, like green infrastructure, power system resilience, protecting sustainable transportation, water and energy conservation, building weatherization to deal with extreme heat and cold. Okay, so these are ways to connect the dots of climate change to climate impacts and ways to deal with them. Okay, this is kind of the risk of climate-related impacts. This came out of IPCC fifth assessment released in 2014 as well. So we are looking at impacts because of emissions and land use change manifest in natural variability and anthropogenic climate change, and we are trying to minimize risk by looking at hazards, exposure, and vulnerability, which determine the net impacts. And we are going to also look at we have to also look at socioeconomic processes that determine total risk in terms of the combination of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure, and they occur through socioeconomic pathways, depend on adaptation, mitigation actions, and of course governance. Then there are details like adaptation gaps, mitigation barriers, institutional awareness, governance issues, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you get the idea of why all these have to go together into climate change and health adaptation. So we'll look at some more specific ideas relating these to health and how the future may look like in terms of assessing climate impacts, assessing vulnerability of health under climate impacts, and what are the climate and health adaptation. Obviously, we cannot separate health as an entity anymore, but there are time scales involved, so you can look at short-term management and avoiding impacts on health and long-term adaptation, which reduce health risks from climate change impacts. Okay, time scales and spatial scales matter, as we have already seen several times. Okay, let's do that in the next podcast.